My family ignored me my entire life and gave my brother $20K, but when I built a $3 million business alone, they came crawling back and my response left them broken. I'm 31 years old. I work in the custom products business that I built from scratch myself. And I need to tell this story because what happened with my family basically defined me as a person. I guess I should start from the beginning. When I was a kid and my parents, David and Karen, decided that I simply wasn't interesting enough to pay attention to. I don't know exactly when it happened, to be honest, but what I do remember perfectly is that from the moment my brother Brandon was born, when I was like 5 years old, things completely changed at home. Brandon was the golden child. You know, that type of kid who could do anything and my parents would act like he'd invented electricity or something. I was there, being a normal kid, getting good grades, behaving well, and I was basically invisible to them. My mom could literally be in the same room with me, and when Brandon walked in, it was like I ceased to exist. She would just turn all her attention to him and I'd be standing there, like furniture. My dad was worse. I mean, at least my mom would sometimes ask me if I'd eaten or if I needed anything for school. But my dad directly treated me like I was an uncomfortable tenant, living in his house, who he tolerated out of obligation. I grew up being the quiet kid, the one who stayed in his room doing homework, while downstairs I could hear my parents laughing with Brandon, celebrating every single thing he did like it was a monumental achievement. Brandon would get a 7 on a test and there'd be cake and celebration. I'd get straight 10s and it was like, "Oh yeah, Alexander, very good. Now let me see what your brother did today." You know what it feels like to grow up like that? It's like starving to death while you watch someone else eat a feast every single day. And when you mention you're hungry, they tell you to stop being dramatic. The thing is, I wasn't a problematic kid. I didn't seek attention in negative ways or anything like that. I was quiet. I liked to read. I was interested in business from a young age because I'd watch entrepreneur shows on TV when everyone was out of the house. I started learning about companies and business strategies basically out of boredom and loneliness, and turns out I was pretty good at understanding those things. When I was in middle school, I already had notebooks full of business ideas, plans, calculations, all that stuff that normal kids don't do. But that I did because I didn't have anyone to play with or really talk to. The moment I remember most, the one that still hurts when I think about it, was when I was like 15 years old. My school organized a business plan competition for students, and I entered because, well, it was literally the only thing I was passionate about at that point in my life. I worked on my project for months, did real market research, interviewing people at the mall, designed an entire marketing strategy, calculated costs and profit projections, like I really went all in on this, and I won. I didn't just win. The judges said my project had real potential and that my parents should consider helping me implement it. I came home that day with my trophy and certificate, excited for the first time in years because I thought, this is different. This is big. They're going to have to acknowledge me now. I walked in and my mom was in the kitchen with Brandon, who was like 10 years old at that point, and he had drawn a logo for an imaginary soccer team or something. I told her mom I won the school business competition, and she said, "Oh, that's nice, Alexander," without even turning to look at me, and then kept telling Brandon that his drawing was incredible and that he should be a graphic designer when he grew up. My dad got home from work an hour later. I told him about my award. He said congratulations without looking up from the newspaper, and that was the entire reaction I got. That night, I heard my parents talking in the living room about how Brandon had so much artistic talent and how they should enroll him in special art classes. They didn't mention my competition once. It was at that moment, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling, that I decided I would never expect anything from them again. I was 15 years old and I basically resigned from having parents emotionally, if that makes sense. I kept living in the house, eating their food, going to school, but mentally, I disconnected from them completely. What happened next was that Brandon, the golden child, decided he also wanted to be an entrepreneur because apparently that was trendy among his friends at the private school they'd enrolled him in. Because, of course, he deserved private education while I was at normal public school. He was like 16 when he told my parents he wanted to start an urban clothing business or something like that, and they literally said yes immediately. My dad pulled out savings, my mom started doing research with him, they hired a business consultant, rented a small space. The whole thing. They spent like $20,000 on Brandon's project without batting an eye. I was there, 18 years old, freshly turned, watching all this happen. And one day at dinner, I mentioned I had ideas for a custom products business, that I'd researched suppliers, and that with $5,000 I could start something small but real. My dad looked at me like I'd asked him to buy me the moon and said, "Alexander, we don't have that kind of money to throw away on crazy ideas. You need to focus on getting a real job when you finish school." I reminded him they'd just given Brandon $20,000, and he said, "That's different. Brandon has real entrepreneurial vision, and we believe in his project." I got up from the table and went to my room without saying anything else, because I knew arguing was pointless. But here's the thing, and this is important because this is where my story really starts to change. I didn't need their money or their approval. It just would have been nice to have it, you know what I mean? During my entire senior year of high school, I secretly worked on my business. I had a part-time job at an electronics store that paid me like $8 an hour, and I saved every penny I could. I found an online supplier that did custom products, t-shirts, mugs, posters, that kind of stuff, and I started selling them in internet forums and social media groups. It was grunt work. I made like $100 or $200 extra a month at first, but to me it was pure gold because it was mine, you know? Nobody had given it to me. Nobody could say I achieved it because of them. My parents had no idea what I was doing because, frankly, they weren't interested. I'd come home from work and from making deliveries of my products and go straight up to my room. They didn't even ask where I'd been. All their energy was on Brandon and his clothing business, which honestly was a disaster from the beginning. The kid had no idea what he was doing, buying super expensive inventory without researching if there was demand, renting spaces in places where nobody walked by, and my parents kept pumping money into it, telling him all businesses take time to take off. I watched the financial disaster that all that was and didn't say anything, because why? They weren't going to listen to me, anyway. I graduated high school with honors, not that anyone cared, and I told my parents I was moving to another state because I'd gotten a job there. It was a lie. I mean, yes, I was moving, but I didn't have a job waiting for me. What I had was a plan. But during that last year, I'd saved like $4,000 between my job and my small business, and I had everything calculated to move to a bigger city where there was more market for custom products. My mom said, "Well, Alexander, take care," and basically that was the entire goodbye I got. My dad wasn't even home when I left. He was helping Brandon with something from his business that, surprise, surprise, was still failing. I moved in with a roommate I found on the internet. We split rent on a horrible apartment that cost like $600 a month, and I worked at whatever during the day while building my business at night. I washed dishes, worked in warehouses, whatever gave me enough to eat and pay rent, while I invested every extra penny into my business. I didn't sleep much, honestly, but I didn't care because for the first time in my life, I was doing something that was completely mine and that nobody could take away or ignore. The business started to grow, slow at first but steady. I got corporate clients who needed promotional products, expanded my catalog, improved my profit margins, finding better suppliers. By the time I was 21, I was making more with my business than at any regular job I could have gotten. And I was able to quit the shit jobs and focus completely on growing the company. I moved to a better apartment, bought equipment to produce some products myself instead of depending only on suppliers, hired my first employee, who was a freelance graphic designer who did the custom designs for clients. During all this time, maybe I talked to my parents once every 2 or 3 months. They were short calls where they'd ask how I was. I'd say fine, and then they'd spend 30 minutes talking about Brandon and his adventures. His clothing business had closed after 2 years of losses, but according to them, it had been because of the economy and bad luck, not because Brandon didn't know what he was doing. Now they were funding his new idea, which was like a concept coffee shop or something, and I just listened, thinking about how much money they'd lost on his dreams, while I built something real, completely alone. Fast forward to when I was 25 years old. My business was genuinely good, like we had real offices, 10 employees, contracts with big companies, and I was making more money than I ever thought I'd have. I bought a small house, a decent car. I could pay all my bills without stress and still save. I wasn't a millionaire or anything dramatic like that, but I was comfortable and secure, and I'd done it all myself without anyone's help. I felt proud, but there was also a part of me that was still angry. you know? Because the whole time I thought about how my parents never believed in me, never gave me even the chance they gave Brandon 1,000 times. Brandon's coffee shop had also failed, obviously. According to what I learned later, they spent like $40,000 on that project, between the location, equipment, inventory, the whole thing. Brandon was like 27 at that point, and had never had a real job in his life. Just failed projects financed by my parents, who were probably in serious financial trouble by then, although they wouldn't admit it. I still didn't tell them anything about my business, because frankly, I didn't owe them that information, and I also didn't want their opinions or their sudden fake interest. Then one day I got a call from my dad, which was weird because he never called me. It was always my mom who made the minimal effort to maintain contact. I answered, and after an awkward hello, he told me, "Alexander, your brother has a very promising new business idea. It's about mobile apps, and we need you to help him with some contacts or advice because we know you're in the business world." Just like that, after years of ignoring me and belittling my ideas, now they wanted me to help the golden child with his umpteenth project doomed to failure. I asked him why he thought I had contacts or knowledge to help, and he said, "Well, you've always been interested in those things, right? Maybe you know someone or have ideas." He didn't mention my high school competition, didn't mention that I had tried to ask them for support years before. Nothing. He just assumed I should be happy to help Brandon because that's how our family worked. I existed to serve my golden brother's needs. I told him I couldn't help and hung up the phone, feeling a mix of rage and satisfaction because I'd finally said no instead of just accepting my role as invisible son. My dad called again 2 days later, now with a different tone, more serious. He told me, "Look, Alexander, I know we haven't been the best parents to you, but your brother really needs help, and we thought maybe you could invest in his idea. It's very good and has real potential." That's when I realized that somehow they'd discovered or assumed I had money. I asked him why he thought I had money to invest, and he got defensive, saying he was just asking, that they didn't need my money, but it would be nice if I could help my brother. I told him, "Dad, let me clarify something. I have a successful custom products business that I started with my own money years ago. I have employees, offices, big contracts, and I make good money, but I'm not going to give Brandon a single penny for another project that's going to fail like all the previous ones." There was silence on the other end of the phone, and then I heard my mom in the background, asking what had happened. My dad explained to her in a trembling voice that I had a successful business and had refused to help Brandon. Then my mom took the phone and started yelling at me, literally yelling, saying, "How could I be so selfish? How could I have money and not help my brother?" That they had given me everything when I was a child, and now I was turning my back on them. I let her vent without interrupting, and when she finished, I told her, "Mom, you didn't give me anything except a roof and food, which is the legal minimum parents have to do. You never supported me emotionally, never believed in me, and when I asked you for help with my business, you told me it was a crazy idea. So I built my life without you, and I don't owe you anything." I hung up the phone, and honestly, I started crying for the first time in years. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was like a release of everything I'd kept bottled up for decades. All that feeling of not being enough, of being invisible, of watching my brother receive everything while I received nothing. I'd finally said it out loud, and they'd heard that I'd been successful in spite of them, not thanks to them. About 2 weeks went by without contact, and then I got a long email from my mom. In the email, she explained that they'd used the money they had set aside for my college on Brandon's businesses because they assumed I wasn't going to go to college, and that if I did, I could get scholarships or loans. I sat there reading that, trying to process that they had literally taken money that was mine by right and given it to my brother without even telling me. The email went on to say they regretted it if that bothered me, but that Brandon needed the support and they thought they were doing the right thing. It wasn't a real apology. It was a justification wrapped in pretty words. I responded telling them that, ironically, I used that money, or, well, the money that should have been that. I used it to start my business, so thanks for the involuntary investment, I guess. They didn't respond to that email, and honestly, I didn't care much because I was tired of all the drama. I continued with my life. My business kept growing. We opened a second office in another city. We reached 15 employees, and things were genuinely going well. Then one day, I was like 28 at that point. I'm in my office working, and my assistant tells me there's a lady here who says she's your mom. I froze because I hadn't given my parents my office address. They didn't even know the name of my company. I went out to reception, and there was Karen, looking older and more tired than I remembered, looking around the office with an expression I couldn't decipher. I took her to a private conference room, and before I could say anything, she started crying, saying she was so sorry that they'd made terrible mistakes, and that they desperately needed my help. She explained through tears that they were in serious debt from all of Brandon's failed businesses, that they'd refinanced the house several times, that they had maxed out credit cards, and that basically they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Brandon, according to her, wasn't talking to them anymore because he was angry they didn't have more money to give him. He'd told them they were failures as parents for not supporting his dreams and had gone to live in another city without leaving them a real address. And now they were coming to me, the son they'd ignored their entire life, asking for financial help because their favorite son had abandoned them. I listened to her with no expression on my face, just letting her talk and empty everything out. When she finished, I asked her why she thought I would help them after everything. She said, "Because you're a better person than your brother. You always were, and we were too blind to see it." I told her I appreciated the words, but that she was coming like 20 years late with that recognition. I told her I wasn't going to give them money, that it wasn't my responsibility to fix the financial mess they'd created themselves, and that they needed to leave. She left crying, and I sat in that conference room for like an hour, just thinking about everything. Brandon also showed up eventually. Like 2 months after my mom, he arrived at my house one night. I don't know how he got my address, but there he was. He looked bad, skinny, with dark circles. And when I let him in, he started with a speech about how sorry he was, about how he'd realized he'd been a terrible brother, about how our parents had ruined his life by spoiling him and never teaching him to really work. He said he'd tried to get a job, but nobody took him seriously because his resume was basically a list of failed businesses and zero real work experience. He asked me, not for money, but for help getting a job, maybe at my company, or with some contact. I told him no, that I wasn't going to mix my business with family problems, and that he needed to figure out his stuff on his own like I had done. He got angry then and started yelling at me, saying I was selfish, that I'd always been weird and bitter, and that he'd tried to be good to me, but I was impossible. I told him to get out of my house and not come back. I never heard directly from him again after that. The following years were weird. I knew from an aunt that my parents had lost the house and were living in a small apartment. Brandon had apparently moved like 2 states away and had a job in sales or something, but wasn't talking to anyone in the family. My parents had tried to contact me several more times, but I ignored their calls and emails because I had nothing to say to them, and frankly, I was focused on my life, which was finally in a good place. When I was 30, I received a physical letter at my office. From my mom. It was like 5 pages handwritten, where she basically told me her entire life, her regrets, how she realized now everything she'd done wrong, how my dad was sick with diabetes and heart problems from stress, how she couldn't sleep at night thinking about how she'd lost both her sons in different ways. She told me she didn't expect my forgiveness, but that she needed me to know she was truly sorry, and that if someday I could find in my heart some compassion, they would be grateful to have some kind of relationship with me again. But the letter ended, saying she understood if I never wanted to see them again, and that she would respect my decision. I kept the letter in a drawer and didn't do anything with it for weeks. I continued with my life, but the letter bothered me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I talked to a therapist because, yes, after everything that happened, I'd finally started therapy to process my childhood. And my therapist asked me what I really wanted. If I wanted to keep them out of my life forever, or if there was some part of me that wanted some kind of resolution. Honestly, I didn't know the answer. I was still angry, but also tired of being angry. You know what I mean? Then my aunt called me one day, like 3 months after the letter, and told me she needed to tell me something important. My parents had been sued by the last landlord of the place Brandon had rented for his coffee shop, something about unpaid damages and a contract they'd signed as guarantors. They were in legal proceedings and would probably have to declare bankruptcy to resolve everything. My aunt told me David couldn't work anymore because of his health, that Karen was working at a clothing store making minimum wage, and that basically they were destroyed financially and emotionally. She asked if I would consider helping them in some way, and I told her I didn't know, that I needed to think about it. I spent like 2 weeks in a weird mental state where part of me felt a horrible satisfaction that they were finally paying for everything they did. But another part felt bad because at the end of the day, they were my parents. And seeing them destroyed like that didn't make me feel as good as I thought it would. I talked more with my therapist about this, and he told me that whatever I decided to do had to be for me, not for them. If I helped them, it had to be because I wanted to, because it would make me feel better as a person, not out of obligation or guilt. I decided to call my mom. When she answered the phone and heard my voice, she immediately started crying. I told her I'd received her letter and that I'd talked to my aunt about their situation. I told her I wasn't ready to forgive everything or to have a normal father-son relationship because frankly I don't know if that's possible after everything, but that I didn't want them to be on the street or without food. I asked her what they really needed, without drama or exaggerations, and she explained their financial situation, which was basically a total disaster. I told them I was going to help them, but with very clear conditions. I wasn't going to give them cash, but I was going to directly pay their rent for a year in a small but decent place. I was going to pay their basic utilities, and I was going to give them a fixed monthly amount for food and necessities that I would deposit in an account I would supervise. In exchange, they had to go to therapy, individual and couples, to work on their issues because clearly they had them. They also had to get help with their finances, like a bankruptcy advisor or someone who would help them restructure everything legally. And they had to accept that this was one-time help. That I wasn't going to become their retirement plan or their permanent financial salvation. My mom accepted everything, crying and thanking me. I told them I wasn't doing it for them, but for me, because I wanted to be able to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing according to my own values, not theirs. Last week I went to visit them at their new apartment. It's small but clean and safe. My dad looked fragile and old, much more than someone his age should look. We talked for a while. It was uncomfortable but not terrible. I made it clear to them again that this didn't mean everything was forgiven or that we were going to be a happy family suddenly. I told them that maybe with time we could build something, but that it had to be real and honest, not based on need or convenience. Now I'm in this weird place where I don't know what's going to happen. Part of me is still angry and resentful about everything I lost, about the childhood I didn't have, about the support I never received. But another part feels relieved to have done something good even when I didn't have to have been a better person than they were to me. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive them or if we'll have a real family relationship. Honestly, I don't know if I want that. But at least I closed that chapter of pure rage and resentment and opened one where I have control of the situation and my decisions. Brandon still isn't talking to anyone in the family from what I know. My parents say they miss him, but they also admit they don't know how to relate to him now. I have no interest in looking for my brother. The truth is we never had a real relationship, so I don't feel like there's anything to fix there. My life continues forward. My business keeps growing. I'm in therapy, working on my issues. And for the first time, I feel like I'm at peace with the decisions I've made. It's not the perfect happy ending people expect in stories, but it's real and it's mine, and that's the only thing that really matters at the end of the day.